One of the main problems faced by residents told that their estate is being considered for regeneration is the disinformation they are given by the local authority or housing association implementing the process. This is compounded by the council officers who run the resident engagement panels and steering groups formed to persuade residents of the benefits of regeneration, by the professional consultants employed to manufacture resident consensus for what they are told will happen, by the architects who visualize the promises of what regeneration will mean for residents, and ultimately by the property developers that will build the new development. For whatever residents are initially told about regeneration, on estates built on London's highly lucrative land, this invariably means the demolition of the existing estate, the redevelopment of new properties at greatly increased densities, and the privatization of the management of the new development. This problem of disinformation, however, isn't confined to residents. Housing campaigners trying to resist the demolition of residents' homes share the same misunderstandings about the costs of estate regeneration. As a result, these campaigns of resistance are almost entirely confined to ethical arguments about the right of the estate community to continue to exist. These arguments are important, but they are of no concern to the agents of regeneration, neither to the developers after the land residents' homes are built on, nor to the council undertaking the process of moving them off it. The registered social landlord, with a local authority or housing association, will make gestures of appeasement towards those rights right up to the moment residents are forcibly evicted from their homes. But those arguments will have little or no influence on what gets built on the land cleared of the demolished homes. What determines that is one thing and one thing only: the financial costs of demolishing and redeveloping estates. It is important, therefore, that residents and campaigners understand these costs and can base their resistance to the estate regeneration programme not only on arguments about ethics, but also on a clear understanding of what will result from the continued demolition of the city's housing estates in the middle of a crisis of housing affordability. The financial figures show that the cost of demolition, of compensation for leaseholders and tenants, and of the construction of new build dwellings is so high in today's housing market that the resulting development will overwhelmingly be composed of properties for private sale, with a hugely reduced number of homes for social rent, increased rental and service charges for existing council tenants, and enormously increased sale prices and reduced tenancy rights for leaseholders. It is on the basis of our understanding of these costs that over the past 3 years, Architects for Social Housing has developed its design alternatives to demolition for 5 London housing estates. Each of these design proposals increase the housing capacity on the estate by between 35 and 50% without demolishing a single existing home or evicting a single residence. The funds raised from the market sale and rent of around half of the new builds means the other half can be allocated as homes for social rent, and the sale and rent revenues from the new builds generate the funds to refurbish and improve the current estate up to at least the decent home standard. Because of this, the Ash model of estate regeneration through refurbishment and infill development is easily the most socially beneficial and environmentally sustainable option to address the crisis of housing affordability in London. But it is also the only financial option that doesn't result in the social cleansing of existing residents from their estate and the mass loss of homes for social rent that is being implemented by the estate regeneration programme in its current form. Estate demolition and redevelopment is a long process. It takes years or even decades to complete. But as we shall see, the results of their regeneration are at enormous odds with the promises made to residents by the landlords implementing them, and the reasons they gave for doing so. So let's start by looking at some of the most famous estate regeneration schemes in London, those which are some way along the process and for which, therefore, accurate figures are available. These first two tables look at 4 estate regeneration schemes. The first 2 of these, the Haygate Estate in the Elephant and Castle and the Aylesbury Estate in Camberwell, are still in progress. The third scheme, Myattsfield North Estate in Brixton, is complete, and the last estate, Central Hill in Crystal Palace, has been condemned for demolition. On the left side of this first slide are the number of homes that have been or are to be demolished in each scheme, and on the right are the number of homes to be built in the new development, usually under a different name. So, the Haygate Estate had 1,214 council homes demolished, while Elephant Park, its replacement, will have 2,535 new properties. The Aylesbury Estate will have 2,704 council homes demolished, while the new Aylesbury development will have around 4,200 properties. The Myattsfield North Estate had 306 council homes demolished, while Over Calter has 808 properties. And the Central Hill Estate will have 456 council homes demolished, while the number of dwellings on the new development is not yet determined, but likely to be anything up to and even exceeding 1,530 properties. As we can see, on each of these schemes, the increase in dwellings from the demolished homes to the developed properties is considerable, between 2 and 3 times as much. The reason why is what we want to focus on in this film. Let's start with leaseholders, as they get the worst deal out of estate redevelopment. We've broken this down into 3 figures. 1, the compensation leaseholders were offered for their demolished homes, which the council are able to buy through compulsory purchase orders. 2, the cost of a shared ownership deal on the new development, indicated as both a required minimum 25% deposit and as a monthly rent. And 3, the full price of a property on the new development. Shared ownership makes up an increasing majority of the new category of affordable housing, which all of London's councils have adopted as the official replacement for homes for social rent being lost to estate demolition schemes. It is also the primary deal offered to existing leaseholders. Shared ownership means the buyer needs a 25% share in the new property. However, this only gives them the tenancy rights of an assured tenant. They don't become the owner of the property until they have purchased 100% of the shares, the price of which will increase with the value of the property. And until that time, they remain an assured tenant. And although they may own just 25% of the property, tenants are liable for 100% of the service charges for the maintenance of the building. Finally, if they default on their rental payments, which can be increased at the discretion of the landlord, shared ownership tenants lose not only their home, but also their down payment on the property as well. On the Haygate Estate, for example, the regeneration of which was initiated back in 1998, the leaseholders were offered on average £120,000 in compensation for a demolished 2-bedroom home. In contrast, on Trafalgar Place, the first redevelopment site completed by property developers Lendlease, a 2-bedroom property went on sale for £725,000. To enter into a shared ownership deal, therefore, the leaseholder required £181,250 for a 25% share, £61,000 more than she was offered for her demolished home, as well as finding an additional £1,250 per month in rent. Because of this, few, if any, of the leaseholders on the Haygate Estate have purchased a property on the Elephant Park development. In the Aylesbury Estate regeneration scheme, which was initiated in 1999, leaseholders were offered £187,000 for their demolished 2-bedroom home, while on Albany Place, the first completed development site, 2-bedroom homes were sold for £550,000. This meant the £137,500 required for a 25% deposit was, in fact, covered by the compensation. However, from being homeowners, most of whom owned their property outright, leaseholders now had to find an additional £945 per month in rent to become no more than assured tenants of Notting Hill Genesis Housing Association. On Myattsfield North Estate, the regeneration of which began in 2002, leaseholders were offered, on average, £114,500 for their demolished homes. Two-bedroom properties on Oval Quarter, the new development, are currently on sale for £595,000. This means the £148,750 required for a 25% share was not covered by the compensation, and that an additional £1,025 per month rent was also required to become nothing more than an assured tenant of the consortium. Moreover, the maintenance of the homes is no longer the responsibility of the council, but has been subcontracted out to Pinnacle PSG, a housing management company. When we get to Central Hill Estate, the regeneration of which was initiated in 2014, Lambeth Council has promised to compensate leaseholders for the demolition of their two-bedroom homes with £340,000, which is considerably more than the sums paid in compensation for equivalent-sized homes on the earlier regeneration schemes. Lambeth Council has currently estimated that a two-bedroom property on the new redevelopment will go on sale for £476,000. This means the leaseholder can purchase something like a 70% share in the new property, somewhat less given that prices will have risen in the 10 years and more it will take for the new redevelopment to be complete. But the assured tenant will, once again, have to find an additional £820 per month in rent, more if the housing association running the new development chooses to raise it. Most residents on council estates, however, aren't leaseholders but tenants, and it is the homes for social rent, in which they currently live on secure tenancies, that make up the greatest loss to the estate regeneration programme. In this table, we've laid out the increases in rent between the social rent homes that are being demolished and the various affordable housing and market rents that are replacing them. Taking the London Borough of Lambeth in 2017 as our example, social rent for a two-bedroom home was £135 per week. London affordable rent, which was recently introduced by the London Mayor, was £159 per week for a two-bedroom home, a weekly increase of £24. London living rent, another new category of affordable rent, is set at a third of the median income in the borough. On the face of it, this sounds like a good deal. However, if you live in the inner London boroughs, where the estate regeneration programme is concentrated, a third of the median income is likely to be far higher than a council tenant and their family can afford to pay. In fact, in Lambeth in 2017, it was £213 per week, more than 1.5 times social rent. Tenancy strategy rent, which is applied to new affordable rent homes for council tenants, was £265 per week for a two-bedroom home. That's nearly double social rent. Intermediate rent, or so-called affordable rent, which is set at up to 80% of market rent, was £384 per week for a two-bedroom home, so nearly 3 times social rent. And finally, market rent, which for a two-bedroom home in Lambeth in 2017 was £480 per week, is 3.5 times as much as social rent. In every case, therefore, when an estate is demolished and redeveloped, the best a council tenant can hope for is an increase in their rent, which for many of them will be sufficient to stop them from returning to the new development. Moreover, in every estate regeneration scheme Ash knows about, responsibility for the affordable housing provision has either been handed over to a housing association or will be developed through a special purpose vehicle that allows the council to act as a housing association. This means that the council tenant will lose what for most of them is their secure tenancy. Under the 1988 Housing Act, housing associations are prohibited from granting secure tenancies, so former council tenants will at best be given assured tenancies, with the considerable loss of tenancy rights that entails. Given these changes, we can now look at how an estate regeneration proceeds. To make this complex process as clear as possible, we're going to use a hypothetical example of an estate of 100 homes. Compared to the actual estate regeneration schemes we've looked at, that's a relatively small estate, but the proportions at each stage of the process are the same, whether they apply to an estate of 100 homes, 500 homes, or 1,000 or more homes. On this hypothetical estate, at the beginning of the regeneration process, 70 of the homes are for council, or what is now called social rent. The remaining 30 homes on the estate are leasehold, purchased under the right to buy, and of these, 10 have been let for market rent. This may seem high, but of the nearly 2 million council homes that have been lost to the right to buy since 1980, over 40% are now being rented out by private landlords. As we've seen from the actual examples we've looked at, since the early 2000s, estate regeneration schemes in London increased the housing capacity on the new development by between 2 and 3 times. So let's take an average increase of 2.5 times and say that the new development will increase our hypothetical estate from 100 homes to 250 properties. Now, what residents are promised at the beginning of this process is that all 70 existing secure tenant households on social rent levels will be rehoused on the new development on the same secure tenancies and at the same social rent levels, while the leaseholders are offered shared ownership deals on the new properties. This is called like-for-like replacement, to which residents are guaranteed first choice by their right to return. To convince the residents that the inconvenience of losing their demolished home is for the greater good as well as their own benefit, the council or housing association also tells them that the new development will contain an additional 50 new homes for London living rent, specifically targeted at young couples trying to get onto London's property ladder. Finally, residents are also told that in order to pay for all this new affordable housing, it is necessary to cross-subsidise it with the construction of properties for market rent and sale. In our hypothetical case, that means an extra 100 properties, which at this stage would typically be divided into 50 for market rent and 50 for market sale. By the beginning of demolition, however, years after the regeneration of the estate was initiated, conditions on the estate have changed. The 70 households on secure social rent tenures have been reduced to 50. Many of these tenants, not wanting to live on a construction site for the next 10 to 20 years, will have taken the council's offer of rehousing elsewhere, either within the borough or outside of it. Indeed, councils actively encourage tenants to move off the estate long before demolition starts. Of the 1,034 secure council tenants on the Haygate estate, only 45 have returned to the new development by February 2013. 216 were rehoused within the SE17 postcode, while the remaining 773 council tenants were scattered across the borough and beyond, with some relocated as far as Greenwich. For the same reasons, the 30 leaseholders on our hypothetical estate have now been reduced to 15. The other 15 have accepted the council's offer of compensation, typically under the threat that the offer would not be renewed, and purchased a place elsewhere. However, given the inadequacy of that compensation, this means buying properties either on the outskirts of London at best, and more often out of the capital altogether. Again, on the Haygate estate scheme, leaseholders ended up in the outer London boroughs of Ealing, Barnet, Enfield, Waltham Forest, Redbridge, Havering, Bromley and Croydon, with the bulk relocating to Bexley, while leaseholders from the Aylesbury estate regeneration have ended up as far away as Leicester, Warwickshire, Wiltshire and Wales. Importantly, in place of these vacated 20 council tenancies and 15 leasehold homes, the empty properties have now been used to house 35 tenants on either short-term tenancies or as property guardianships. This serves several purposes. Such tenancies have no rights of tenure, so the tenants can be given 1 month and 2 weeks' notice respectively, and the council has no obligation or responsibility for rehousing them. Most importantly, reducing the number of households on secure tenancies by the time of demolition means those households don't have to be rehoused on the new development. This reduces the number of replacement homes for social or affordable rents that have to be included on the new development, and therefore increases the number of properties that can be built for shared ownership or market sale. By the end of the redevelopment, therefore, things have turned out far worse than the residents could have imagined when they were told that their estate was up for regeneration. The 70 like-for-like replacement homes secure tenants were promised have been reduced to a mere 25. And those are not for social rent, but for London affordable rent. At best, these will house 25 of the remaining 50 tenant households with secure tenancies. But these will lose that security and have to come up with the increased rental and service charges if they want to enact what they were promised was their right to return to the new development. But what of the other 25 council tenants? Well, under the deceptive category of affordable housing, the remaining 25 homes the council is obliged to provide for secure tenants have now materialised as London living rent. As we saw, this is more than 1.5 times social rent. Worse still, this is a rent-to-buy product, and tenants who enter into the deal are contractually required not only to find the extra 50% rent and service charges, but also to put aside sufficient funds to buy the property within 10 years. If they don't, they will lose their assured tenancy. The bulk of the so-called affordable housing provision on the new development, however, is made up of shared ownership properties. On our hypothetical estate redevelopment, these account for 50 of the 250 new properties, a fifth of the total dwellings, but half of the affordable housing provision. Only 15 of these, at best, will be taken up by the former leaseholders whose homes have been demolished, and who will now become assured tenants. The remaining 35 are for new residents looking to get on London's property ladder and willing to enter into what we have seen are the extraordinarily risky conditions of a shared ownership deal. Despite this, with the 25 London affordable rent homes and the 25 London living rent properties, the 50 shared ownership properties together make up 40% of the total new builds. Although reached with the loss of 70 homes for social rent and 30 leasehold homes demolished, in London, this percentage of affordable housing qualifies the new development for full public funding. Finally, what of the other 150 properties, which make up 60% of the new development? Well, 25 of these, 10% of the total, are for market rent, which means 3.5 times social rent. But the remaining 125 properties, 50% of the entire new development, and 2.5 times the number residents were originally promised, are now for private sale. Bad as this is, however, the reality of our hypothetical estate regeneration is even worse. This is because of the difference between the tenure of the new dwellings at the end of redevelopment and their actual use. First of all, either because of their inability to afford the more than 50% increase on their rent and service charges, or because they cannot raise the money necessary to purchase the property, sooner or later, 5 of the households in the London living rent properties will be unable to keep up the necessary payments. Under the Greater London Authority's policy on London living rent, this means their homes now revert to shared ownership properties. Of the affordable housing provision on the new development, therefore, there are now 25 homes for London affordable rent, 20 for London living rent, a reduction of 5, and 55 for shared ownership, an increase of 5. The crucial change, however, between the tenure at which the new properties were sold and the tenure of their use is in the 150 properties for market rent and sale. This is because the buyers of the properties for private sale are not living in them. On the Southgate Gardens development, for example, built on the former Haygate estate, every one of 51 properties was sold to overseas investors. What this means for our hypothetical estate redevelopment is that of the 125 properties for market sale, only 25 are now owner-occupied. 75 are buy-to-let, and the remaining 25 are buy-to-leave. This means they've been purchased purely as an investment and are not being used either by their owners or by anyone else as housing. But the 75 buy-to-let properties means the properties for market rent have now increased from 25 to 100 dwellings, 40% of the entire new development. So, what does this programme of demolition and redevelopment mean socially for our hypothetical estate of 100 households? Of this estate community, a total of 70 households have now been evicted from their homes as a direct result of the regeneration of their estate, never to return. 45 of these households were council tenants who will be rehoused elsewhere, either within the borough or outside. 15 of the households were leaseholders who have taken the compensation for their demolished homes and bought or rented elsewhere, typically in outer London or outside of London altogether. Finally, 10 of these evicted households were private renters who have moved onto what we have seen is an increasingly unaffordable private rental market. Some of these, unable to afford this market, will have become homeless. Of the 100 households that were promised the right to return, 25 former council tenants out of the original 70 are now housing association tenants living in London affordable rent tenancies. Of the original 30 leaseholders, only 5 have returned, and these are now assured tenants on shared ownership deals, with the increased mortgage repayments and almost non-existent rights of ownership that entails. This is what the right to return means for existing residents whose estate is regenerated. So what of the new residents, for whom the regeneration programme has supposedly been developed as the only means of addressing our so-called housing crisis? Well, 20 of these households have the income to pay for a London living rent tenancy, while saving sufficient funds to get a mortgage on the property within 10 years. To get an idea of what this requires, rent-to-buy deals are available to households earning up to £60,000 per year. 50 of the new resident households have entered into shared ownership deals. This means, as we've seen, finding a 25% share on properties averaging around £650,000 in inner London, so at least £162,500 plus £1,100 per month rent. To give you an idea of what this requires in terms of household income, to buy a £450,000 home requires a 21.5% deposit of £97,000 and a salary of £77,000 per year. We shouldn't forget that, in the language of estate regeneration, all 3 of these tenancy types are categorised as affordable housing. But that isn't all. 25 of the new resident households are homeowners who can afford these prices, and 25 of the market sale properties are long-term empty, purchased as an investment in London's housing market by non-domicile owners. But the bulk of the new residents, 100 out of the 195 new households, and 40% of the 250 households in total, are the renters of the 25 dwellings for market rent and the 75 buy-to-rent properties. We want to emphasise that these figures are as good as it gets. The proportion of residents socially cleansed from their homes in our hypothetical example is far lower than the actual regeneration schemes we started this presentation by looking at, such as the Haygate and Aylesbury estates. The figures and proportions we're using for our hypothetical example are based on the best deals for tenants, the highest levels of compensation for leaseholders, and the greatest number of replacement homes for London affordable rent. Most regeneration schemes that demolish and redevelop the estates will turn out far worse than this for residents both old and new. Why is this the case? To answer this question, we have to look at what the UK government is and isn't funding. This in turn will tell us what it wants councils to build on the land cleared of demolished council estates under the cloak of regeneration. This next table shows the latest round of funding guidance to come out of the Greater London Authority, which has been given £4.8 billion of government funding to build 116,000 affordable homes by March 2022. Homes for social rent and homes for London affordable rent will be subsidised to the sum of £100,000 per new build dwelling. All the other forms of affordable housing, including London living rent, tenancy strategy rent, intermediate rent and shared ownership, will receive £38,000 for every dwelling started between 2018 and 2019, and £28,000 per dwelling if started between 2020 and 2022. These, however, are not the only government subsidies. In addition to this funding to build affordable housing provision, there also exists subsidies for purchasing such properties. London living rent, which requires the householder to take out a mortgage on the property within 10 years, is subsidised for the first 5 years under the government's rent-to-buy scheme. This is available to households earning up to £60,000 per year. Shared ownership is an even greater subsidy of middle-income earners, with the government's Help to Buy scheme being available to households earning up to £90,000 per year. In London, this equates to a 5-year interest-free government loan for up to 40% of the price of a property worth up to £600,000. Quite extraordinarily, for a government that claims council estates are unsustainably subsidised by the state, for the 5 years between 2016 and 2021, the same government, through its shared ownership and affordable homes programme, has allocated £4.1 billion in funds to Help to Buy. In contrast, only £1.67 billion was belatedly allocated in June of this year to build homes for social rent. Against these subsidies, let's look at what it costs to build new dwellings today. These costs are very important when establishing two things. First, what proportion of the new builds on an estate redevelopment scheme need to be for market sale, market rent, and all the types of affordable housing in order to cover the costs of redevelopment. And second, what increase in housing capacity over that of the demolished estate the redevelopment has to achieve in order to supply the sufficient number of properties to meet those costs. For easier comparison, these costs are represented on this table at the same scale as the different government subsidies in the previous table. The cost of materials and construction alone come to £212,000 per dwelling. Professional fees for contractors and Section 106 agreements, the latter including the developer's contribution for affordable housing, come to £38,500 per dwelling. Marketing and letting fees come to £7,500 per dwelling. Finance, which largely consists of the interest on the loans required to fund the scheme, come to £8,000 per dwelling. And finally, developer profit, based on the 21% of private sales, comes to £39,000 per dwelling. All of which adds up to a total cost per new build dwelling constructed of £305,000. This is a figure that might surprise a lot of people, in which the councils implementing state demolition schemes do their best to keep quiet. Let's look at the reason why. Residents informed that their homes are to be demolished are consistently told that the council is compelled to do so because the cost of refurbishing the estate is too high, and redevelopment is the only financially viable option. The truth, however, is that demolition and redevelopment is many times the cost of refurbishment. High as the construction cost of £305,000 per new build dwelling might seem, in fact, the cost of redevelopment doesn't stop there. Or rather, it doesn't start there, because before the council can construct a new development, it needs to demolish the existing one. The cost of redevelopment therefore starts with the cost of demolition. This varies depending on the size and height of the individual buildings, their means of construction, and the ease of access to them. It also includes the demolition of the estate's commercial, communal, and administrative buildings, as well as its public spaces, its sport grounds, car parks and garages, plus any below-ground demolition. Because of this, the average cost of demolition is around £50,000 per dwelling. In contrast, bringing homes up to the Decent Home Standard Plus means giving them new kitchens, new bathrooms, new heating systems, new boilers, rewiring, new windows and external doors and new painting finishes. But the full refurbishment of an estate also includes external mechanical and electrical works, including new pipework, gas installation, door entry systems, fire stopping and repairs to communal areas, external refurbishment costs and external works, including new roofing and scaffolding. In other words, the refurbished estate will be in better condition than it ever was and have better facilities than it ever had. So how much does this cost? Based on estimates for the Aylesbury estate, which is one of the most run-down and neglected estates in London, the refurbishment of an entire estate up to the Decent Home Standard Plus costs on average £50,000 per home. As we've seen, that's the same cost per home as demolishing the entire estate. It's extraordinary, therefore, that although there is funding for building affordable housing, at least 2/3 of which are properties for sale at up to £600,000, neither the government nor the Greater London Authority has allocated funding for the refurbishment of the homes for social rent our councils are demolishing in order to build these properties. Now let's return to our hypothetical demolition of an estate of 100 homes and its redevelopment as 250 properties on the tenure mix we've already established as typical of regeneration schemes. To assess the income from this scheme, let's start with the subsidies the developer will get from the government for building the new dwellings. 25 dwellings for London affordable rent at £100,000 per home will receive £2.5 million. 25 dwellings for London living rent at £38,000 per home will receive £950,000. And 50 shared ownership properties at £38,000 per home will receive £1.9 million. That's a total government subsidy of £5.35 million. Then looking at the income the developer will receive from rents and sales, this will vary depending on the number of bedrooms in each property, but based on a 2-bedroom home, 25 properties for London affordable rent at £159 per week produces an annual rent of £206,700. 25 properties for London living rent at £213 per week produce an annual rent of £276,900. 50 shared ownership properties at £1,100 per month produce an annual rent of £660,400, and 25 properties for market rent at £480 per week produce an annual rent of £624,000. Now, when management and maintenance costs are deducted, only 47% of affordable housing revenue and 75% of private housing revenue is rental income, so these figures will need to be adjusted. However, it is in sales that the overwhelming majority of the developer's investment is recovered. Sales receipts on the 25% share of the 50 shared ownership properties at an average of £650,000 per dwelling come to £8.125 million, while sales receipts on the 125 properties for market sale, again at an average sale price of £650,000, are £81.25 million. So, to add up the developer's income, the total subsidies come to £5.35 million, the total sales to £89.375 million, and the net rent, extended over the first 10 years of the development, is £10.0568 million, all of which gives the developer a total income of nearly £105 million. Now let's look at the costs of this hypothetical scheme, based on the figures we've established. First, the demolition of the existing 100 homes at the cost of £50,000 per home is £5 million. The construction of 250 new dwellings at £305,000 per dwelling is £76.25 million. However, the cost of demolition and construction is not the complete cost of redevelopment. Now we come to some new costs, the first of which is what is called decant costs. This includes home loss and disturbance costs for the 70 council tenants, plus disturbance costs and compensation for the 30 leaseholders. These sums are offered to residents by the council in compensation for the loss of their homes, for their moving expenses, and, above all, to compulsory purchase leaseholders' homes. As we have seen, the tiny sums offered to the leaseholders of the Haygate, Aylesbury and Myattsfield North estates in the early 2000s are slowly being corrected to more accurately reflect the market value of leaseholders' homes. The figure of £340,000 is an average drawn from what Lambeth Council is currently offering leaseholders of 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom and 3-bedroom homes on estates the council is proposing to demolish. Applying these figures to the decant costs for our hypothetical estate regeneration gives us a total cost of £11.15 million. That alone is considerably more than double the £5 million cost of refurbishing the 100 homes up to the Decent Home Standard Plus. But the cost of demolishing and redeveloping our hypothetical estate hasn't finished there. New developments include more than residential blocks, with concierges, sports facilities, private gardens and other landscaping. Under the category of external works, this comes to an average of £6,000 per dwelling, which for 250 new build dwellings is a further £1.5 million. Finally, as in all development schemes, there must be a contingency sum set aside for increases in expenditure as the project unfolds. This is typically set at 10% of construction costs and professional fees, which in this case comes to £7.775 million. Altogether, therefore, the cost of demolishing our hypothetical estate of 100 homes, of building 250 new build properties in their place, of compensating existing tenants and leaseholders, plus external works with contingency sums, comes to nearly £102 million. This is only £3 million less than the developer will recoup, even with their 21% profit margins in the first 10 years. It should be borne in mind that in our hypothetical example, the land on which the demolished estate is built has been retained in the ownership of the council, and therefore has not been added as an additional cost to the developer. However, In the Haygate and Aylesbury estate regeneration schemes, the land was sold to the developers. And although the price the council charged for the land was minimal and not a fraction of its actual market cost, in some cases, the cost of our hypothetical regeneration scheme to the developer would include the additional land costs, further eating into their profits. So what does this mean? It means that when an estate regeneration proceeds by demolishing the existing estate and building a new development, the cost of doing so is so high that the housing capacity of the demolished estate will have to be increased by between 2.5 and 3 times. But it also means that properties for market sale at upwards of £500,000 must make up at least 50% of the total number of new dwellings, and that the bulk of the affordable housing provision must be for shared ownership. This means that when councils, at the beginning of the regeneration process, tell residents that they are all going to be rehoused on the new development in like-for-like replacements for their demolished homes, they are lying. It never has happened, and it will continue not to happen. Not because councils are corrupt or because developers are greedy. It won't happen because as soon as a council demolishes a housing estate, the financial requirements of the market means they will have to build the properties that will return the 20 to 25% profit margins their private development partners can and do demand. This is an economic given, which slight variations in the provision of affordable housing allocated or the amount of government funding will not change. Under existing government policy and market conditions, estate regeneration means the demolition of the existing estate, the social cleansing of the estate community, the mass loss of homes for social rent, and the privatisation of the new development, with at least half the new dwellings built for market sale at the highest possible price. So, what's the alternative? Having informed residents that their estate is being considered for regeneration, councils inevitably conclude that the only option is to demolish and redevelop the estate. In justifying this conclusion, they typically cite 3 main reasons for doing so. First, that given the housing crisis, councils are under obligation to use council land to increase the housing capacity on existing estates. Second, that the existing estate has reached the end of its natural lifespan, and its refurbishment will not address problems the council has identified as inherent to both the design and the build quality of post-war housing estates. And third, that under central government cuts to their budgets, councils cannot afford to undertake the maintenance of the existing homes, and that only demolition and redevelopment will provide the solutions to a physically declining estate. Now, all 3 of these reasons are fundamentally flawed, and any campaign to resist the demolition of an estate must understand why. Let's start by being clear what these problems are and are not. First, any plan to address the housing crisis must not simply increase housing capacity, but must increase the number of homes in which people can actually afford to live. This doesn't include most of what is being built under the umbrella of affordable housing, which as we have seen is targeted at middle-income households making between £60,000 and £90,000 per annum. Still less does it include properties for market sale for £500,000 and more. 58% of housing demand in London is for homes for social rent and properties for sale at up to £450 per square foot, which is lower than all but the cheapest London property in the outer boroughs. This is the housing we need to build. Second, post-war estates built from reinforced concrete have not come to the end of their natural lifespan, but the components that have been starved of maintenance for decades sometimes have. What is required is not demolition, but repair and maintenance of estates that have typically been subject to a process of managed decline by the councils intent on demolishing them. And third, far from being financially unviable, the cost of refurbishment is far less than the cost of demolishing estates and redeveloping them as property for market sale and so-called affordable housing that is in fact unaffordable to the majority of current estate residents. In April 2015, Ash was contacted by the residents of Central Hill, a council estate in Crystal Palace that had recently been placed on Lambeth Council's estate regeneration programme. Working with the residents over the next year, Ash developed a design alternative to demolition that proposed the addition of up to 242 new dwellings on the estate without having to demolish a single existing home or evict a single existing resident. Some of these new dwellings are infill homes, so located on land identified by the residents. Some of them are roof extensions to existing housing, which are able to take 1 or 2 additional stories of lightweight timber-framed buildings. Together with the West Kensington and Gibbs Green estates in Hammersmith and Fulham, Knight's Walk in Lambeth and the Northwold estate in Hackney, Central Hill is one of 5 estates for which Ash has developed this model of estate regeneration. And on each estate, we were able to increase the housing capacity by between 35 and 50% of its current provision. Indeed, given the amount of land on most estates and the structural strength of the buildings, the capacity for increase in their housing provision is limited primarily by the wishes of the residents. Central Hill Estate has 476 homes. 340 of these are for social rent and 136 are leasehold. Ash's proposal is to build an additional 242 new dwellings. We estimate that we can make 120 of those new builds available for social rent, 60 for market rent, and put 62 up for market sale. That makes an estate of 718 dwellings, a 51% increase in housing capacity, of which 460 are for social rent. That's 64% of the total, with all the existing social rent and leasehold homes refurbished up to decent home standard. This is the Ash model of estate regeneration. In comparison, Lambeth Council employed PRP architects to draw up a series of options for the demolition of 456 of the existing homes and the redevelopment of Central Hill Estate as a housing association. Each of these solutions proposed a huge increase in housing density in order to cover the costs of demolition, compensation and redevelopment that we've already looked at. The option with the highest increase in density that we have seen is the proposal for a new development of 1,530 dwellings, more than 3 times the housing capacity of the existing estate. This redevelopment of Central Hill comprises 320 homes for London affordable rent, 100 homes for tenancy strategy rent, and 109 properties for shared ownership. These 3 categories comprise the development's affordable housing provision, which together make up only 27% of the total. The 320 homes for London affordable rent are 140 less than the 460 homes for social rent in the Ash scheme, 20 less than the existing 340 homes for social rent, and £24 per week more expensive, with increased service charges and the loss of secure tenancy rights. Even with the addition of 100 homes for tenancy strategy rent, which is double social rent, there are 40 less homes for affordable rent than the Ash scheme has for social rent. But to pay for all this waste, the new development will also have 246 dwellings for market rent, which is 3.5 times social rent, plus an enormous 765 properties for market sale. This latter tenancy type comprising a full 50% of the entire development. As we can see, in its increase in housing density and in its proportion of tenure types, this actual option is very close to the hypothetical example we were looking at earlier. And we can expect a similar difference between the tenure these properties are sold at and their use as accommodation, with the bulk of the properties being purchased by buy-to-let landlords. All of which raises several questions. How does the reduction of 340 homes for social rent to 320 homes for London affordable rent benefit existing tenants of the estate? How does the building of 100 homes for tenancy strategy rent and 246 homes for market rent benefit constituents of the borough, when studies have consistently shown that the primary rental housing need in London is for homes for social rent? How does the replacement of 136 leaseholder homes with 109 properties for shared ownership benefit those residents who've placed their life savings into their council properties and were looking forward to a financially secure future? How does the construction of 765 properties for market sale, at an estimated average of £463,500 at today's prices, and far more by the time they're completed, benefit anyone except those middle-income families earning up to £90,000 per year who qualify for Help to Buy, the buy-to-let landlords who will purchase those properties and rent them out on the private rental market, the buy-to-leave property investors, and above all, the private development partners who profit from the demolition and redevelopment of the estate? Finally, how does this model of estate regeneration do anything to address London's crisis of housing affordability, when all the facts show it to be reproducing and expanding this crisis? In drawing up our proposals, Ash was able to draw on the services of Robert Martell and Partners, an established company of quantity surveyors who produced a cost assessment of the Ash proposal. Refurbishing all 476 homes on the estate had been previously estimated by Lambeth Council itself at £18.5 million. External works and services to the estate were estimated by Robert Martell and Partners at £4.15 million. Professional fees come to £10.1 million. A standard 10% contingency sum comes to £6.13 million. And the cost of construction of the 242 new build dwellings comes to £45 million. So, the total cost of the Ash proposal for an estate of 718 dwellings is £84 million. To this must be added marketing and letting fees, finance costs and developer profit. Using the same figures calculated by Notting Hill Housing Trust for the Aylesbury estate, we get the following sums. Marketing and letting fees, given that half the new build dwellings in the Ash proposal are for social rent, and would be allocated by the council rather than marketed by a housing association, are likely to be far lower, but in the absence of information from the council, we'll stick with the figure of £7,500 per new build dwelling. This comes to £1.815 million. Finance at £8,000 per new build dwelling comes to £1.936 million. Developer profit, given that councils have argued that carrying out the redevelopment through a special purpose vehicle rather than a developer will be able to remove this cost, is also likely to be much lower. But again, in the absence of any financial information from those councils, and at the same sum of £39,000 per new build dwelling used by Notting Hill Housing Trust, this comes to £9.38 million. So that's an additional £13.189 million in costs, taking the total cost of the Ash proposal to around £97 million. For all the reasons listed here, this is likely to be too high an estimate by maybe around £10 million, but we'll use it as a yardstick. Now for the costs of Lambeth Council's proposals. On their financial viability report, the construction costs, which includes materials and construction, professional fees and Section 106 agreements, marketing and letting fees, finance and developer profit, were all redacted by Lambeth Council. The excuse for this was that the figures on which the viability of those proposals were made were judged to be commercially confidential. In their absence, therefore, Ash has made our own estimates of the cost of Lambeth Council's proposals based on the figures we have already looked at. The cost of decanting 456 households is £25.65 million. This is Lambeth Council's own estimate, taken from the few figures not redacted from its viability assessment. The cost of demolishing 456 homes, at an average of £50,000 per home, is £22.8 million. So far, therefore, before a single home has been built, Lambeth Council is looking at a bill of £48.45 million just to take possession of the cleared land. The cost of construction is more complex, but taking a baseline of £305,000 per dwelling that we've already established, we need to add an additional £6,000 per dwelling for external works and services and a 10% contingency sum, all of which comes to £342,000 per dwelling. To rebuild the 456 demolished homes, therefore, comes to £156 million. So simply replacing what is already there, together with the decant and demolition costs, comes to £204.5 million. That's more than double the cost of the Ash proposal, without adding a single additional dwelling. To match the total number of homes in the Ash proposal is even more expensive. The construction of 718 dwellings at £342,000 per dwelling is £245.5 million, making the entire scheme come to £294 million. That's 3 times the cost of the Ash proposal to reach the same number of dwellings. To pay for this, however, we've seen that the number of new dwellings on an estate regeneration that demolishes the existing homes and builds a new development from scratch has to increase the housing density by between 2.5 and 3 times if it's to make the profit developers demand. The most likely option Lambeth Council will take, therefore, is something like the proposal for a development of 1,530 dwellings. At £342,000 per dwelling, that will cost £523.25 million, with a total cost for the scheme of £571.7 million. That's nearly 6 times the cost of the Ash proposal. In fact, in the viability assessment for this option prepared for Lambeth Council, the indicative finance cost for this proposal is calculated at £560.4 million. However, this left off the cost of demolition, which at an estimated £22.8 million brings the whole scheme up to £583.2 million. That's slightly more than, but not far off, our own estimate. Given that Ash has had no access whatsoever to the bulk of those costs, this is remarkably close to our own assessment of £571.7 million, and it indicates that our own estimates are accurate in their assumptions and calculations. Given this accuracy, we feel confident that we can produce a similarly accurate viability assessment of our own proposal for the refurbishment of 376 homes and the infill and roof extension development of 242 new dwellings on Central Hill Estate. To make this as clear as possible, the scale of this table has been enlarged 7 times over that used for the proposals by Lambeth Council. First of all, subsidies for 120 homes for social rent at £100,000 per dwelling come to £12 million. Net social rent on 460 homes, calculated at 47% of gross on an average rent of £140 per week for the first 25 years, is £39.35 million. Net market rent on 60 homes, calculated at 75% of gross on an average rent of £320 per week for the first 25 years, is £18.75 million. And finally, market sale of 62 properties at an average of £463,500 per property is £28.737 million. In the first 25 years, therefore, revenues from subsidies, rent and sales come to £98.837 million, covering our £97 million cost estimate for the construction of 242 new build dwellings and the refurbishment of the existing 476 homes. This shouldn't be surprising. Property development, after all, is a lucrative business, and with the subsidies from the Greater London Authority and the extraordinarily high prices of London property, it is quite possible to generate the funds to build the homes for social rent that is the highest demand rental housing in London, but only when they are built as part of an existing estate, not on the ruins of its demolition. Until Ash finds the help of a quantity surveyor willing to undertake this work for us, we're not able to calculate a viability assessment on the Ash proposal with any greater accuracy. But, given the closeness of our calculations for the development of 1,530 homes to that produced for Lambeth Council, we're confident that our own viability assessment is not far off. Indeed, what our figures show is that over a longer time period, some of our proposed 60 new build dwellings for market rent could be turned into a far lower rent category, perhaps even into homes for social rent. The viability assessments for Lambeth Council's proposed options were calculated on revenues over 60 years. We've shown that the Ash proposal recovers its expenditures in less than 25 years. Everything is possible if councils are willing to look at the possibilities. These possibilities become radically reduced, however, as soon as an estate is demolished. At that point, the huge increase in the housing capacity of the new development and the re-tenure of the new properties along the lines we've looked at in this report becomes inevitable. Demolishing and redeveloping estates is not a financial necessity, but a political choice, and one that does nothing to address the crisis of housing affordability in London. On the contrary, as the figures in this report demonstrate, by demolishing our council estates and replacing homes for social rent with so-called affordable housing and properties for market rent and sale, the estate demolition programme is expanding the housing crisis at the cost of the increased housing poverty and homelessness of its citizens. For all the reasons outlined in this report, Ash has made the following policy proposals on estate regeneration. 1. When proposing an estate regeneration scheme, a registered provider of social housing and their private investment partners must set aside sufficient funds for a refurbishment and infill option to be developed up to feasibility study stage. This option must be designed, assessed and costed by a team of architects, engineers and quantity surveyors independent from the team given the brief for the demolition and redevelopment option. 2. This independent team must be given funds from the registered provider of social housing and investment partners implementing the scheme and/or the Greater London Authority to produce an impact assessment of the social, financial and environmental costs of demolition and redevelopment for existing residents, the local community and the landlord. The findings of this assessment must be overseen and verified by an independent supervisor and made public before any resident ballot is held on regeneration. 3. Enforceable target requirements must be set in Greater London Authority policy, defining what an estate regeneration scheme is required to meet before receiving either GLA funding or local authority planning permission. These targets must be written not in vague phrases about like-for-like replacement of homes, residents' financially contingent right to return to them, or undefined proportions of promised affordable housing, but in non-negotiable, clearly defined numbers, proportions, tenures, and rent levels that are not subject to, for example, the future viability assessments of investment partners. 4. If an estate community votes against a proposed demolition and redevelopment scheme, the registered provider of social housing must carry out the refurbishment and continue, or where appropriate, restart, the maintenance of the estate at the very least. Where it is necessary to the funding for this refurbishment, and with the agreement of residents, the registered provider should implement the infill housing produced by the independent team employed to develop this option. In this way, residents cannot be presented with a choice between the demolition of their estate and its managed decline. And 5. The London Mayor must allocate sufficient funds for estate refurbishment and infill, which at present are entirely lacking, through his Homes for Londoners programme. If residents vote for this option, these funds must be made available to them, either working in tandem with the council or through the various forms of resident-managed and community-led models being explored by residents who have lost confidence in councils that are implementing the demolition and redevelopment of their homes for the benefit of their investment partners.